The candles in the great hall of Veyrath had barely settled into their steady glow when a low growl rolled through the crowd, and every noble in the room froze where they stood. Mira Hollis felt it before she heard it, a vibration that moved through the marble floor and up through the soles of her worn shoes, and she turned just in time to see the Alpha King rise from his throne so fast that his goblet of wine tipped and shattered against the stone. Nobody in the hall understood what was happening. One moment King Roran Ashgard had been sitting through the parade of daughters with the bored, distant look he always wore during the selection ball, and the next moment his chair had scraped backward with a violence that sent 2 servants scrambling out of his path. His eyes, usually a calm and controlled shade of gray, had gone bright gold, the color that only appeared when his wolf pushed close to the surface. Mira took a step back without meaning to. She had come to the ball only because attendance was required of every unmarried woman from a registered pack, and she had spent the last 3 hours trying to disappear into the shadows near the far wall, away from the glittering procession of silk gowns and jeweled hairpins. Her own dress was plain gray wool, mended twice at the hem, and her hair was pulled back in a simple braid that her stepsister Nora had mocked only an hour earlier, calling her a servant who had wandered into the wrong room by mistake. She had no wish to be noticed. She had spent her whole life being told, gently and then not so gently, that she was the kind of girl who faded into a crowd, the kind of girl a king would never look twice at. So when Roran's gaze swept across the hall and locked directly onto her, she assumed for one confused second that he was looking at someone standing behind her. He was not. The king moved through the crowd like a man wading through water that refused to slow him down. Nobles who moments before had been vying for his attention now scrambled out of his way, pressing themselves against pillars and each other, whispering questions nobody could answer. Lady Seraphine Voss, who had spent the entire evening at the center of his attention, who wore a gown of deep violet, chosen specifically because it matched the sash he always wore at official functions, stood with her mouth slightly open as the king walked straight past her without a glance. Mira's heart slammed against her ribs so hard she thought everyone around her must be able to hear it. She looked left, then right, certain there had to be another explanation, but the crowd had already begun to part like a curtain being drawn back, and there was nowhere left to hide. Roran stopped only a few feet from her. Up close, he was larger than she had realized, broad through the shoulders, in a way that made the ornate blue coat he wore look almost too small for him. His jaw was tight, his breathing controlled but deliberate, as though he were holding something powerful on a very short leash. When he spoke, his voice came out rough, almost a growl itself. "What is your name?" For a moment, Mira could not make her mouth work. The entire hall had gone silent, except for the crackle of the candles and the soft rustle of 100 people leaning forward to hear her answer. "Mira," she finally managed. "Mira Hollis, Your Majesty." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise, as though the name meant something to him that it did not mean to her. He inhaled slowly, and she watched his shoulders relax by some small degree, though the gold had not faded from his eyes. Then, in front of the entire court, in front of the nobles who had spent months preparing their daughters for this exact moment, King Roran Ashgard lowered himself onto one knee. A collective gasp rippled through the hall, sharp enough that Mira flinched at the sound of it. She heard her stepmother's voice somewhere behind her, a strangled sound of disbelief, and she heard Nora's sharper intake of breath, but none of it fully registered, because the king of the largest kingdom of the northern Pax was kneeling in front of her, his golden eyes fixed on her face, as though she were the only person in the room. "Mira Hollis," he said, loud enough now for every corner of the hall to hear. "I choose you." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples spread outward in the form of whispers, then murmurs. Then, from somewhere near the back, an outright cry of protest that someone quickly hushed. Mira did not know what to do with her hands. She did not know what to do with her face. She had walked into the ball that evening, expecting to spend 3 hours standing quietly against a wall, and then walking home in the dark, with her stepmother complaining the entire way about wasted opportunities and wasted dresses. She had never once imagined that she would be the center of anything, least of all the center of the most important selection ceremony the kingdom held every generation. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, aware that every word she chose now would be repeated and dissected for weeks. "I think there has been some mistake." His eyes narrowed, not with anger but with something closer to certainty. There is no mistake. He rose to his feet in one smooth motion and extended a hand toward her, palm up, waiting. I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Behind her, Mira heard Nora's voice cut through the murmuring crowd, sharp and desperate. This is absurd. She is nobody. She is barely even a member of a real pack. Your Majesty, surely you meant to select someone else. A low sound rumbled from Roran's chest. Not quite a growl, but close enough that several nobles near him took an involuntary step back. He did not look at Nora. His eyes stayed on Mira. I know exactly who I have chosen, he said. His voice had dropped, quieter now, meant only for her, even though the whole room could still hear. My wolf has been searching for a very long time. Tonight, it stopped searching. Mira felt heat rise in her cheeks, and beneath the embarrassment of being stared at by every person she had ever known, something else stirred, something she could not name yet, a pull toward him that felt less like attraction and more like recognition, as though some part of her had been waiting for this exact moment without knowing it. She placed her hand in his. The instant their skin touched, a jolt passed between them, sharp enough that she gasped, and he inhaled sharply through his nose. His grip tightened around her fingers, not painfully, but firmly, as though he were afraid she might vanish if he let go. Around them, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, more disbelieving, but neither of them moved to explain, because neither of them fully understood what had just happened. The selection ball did not end the way it usually did, with polite congratulations and careful diplomacy. Instead, it dissolved into chaos, nobles clustering into small groups to whisper theories, some claiming dark magic, others claiming the king had simply lost his mind, and a few, the wisest among them, saying nothing at all, and simply watching Mira with calculating eyes, already trying to determine how her sudden rise might affect their own standing. Mira's stepmother, Beatrice Hollis, pushed through the crowd with the kind of desperate energy she usually reserved for arguing prices down at market. Her face had gone pale, then flushed, as though she could not decide whether to be furious or thrilled. Your Majesty, she said, curtsying so low it looked almost painful. Forgive my stepdaughter. She is unused to attention of this kind. She was raised very simply, very humbly. That is precisely why I chose her, Roran said, cutting her off without raising his voice, though the words carried an authority that silenced Beatrice instantly. He turned back to Mira. Will you come with me? It was not truly a question. Everyone in the hall understood that. The Alpha King did not ask twice, and no one, least of all a girl with no title and no fortune, said no to him in front of his entire court. And yet Mira noticed, with a small flicker of surprise, that he was waiting for her answer anyway, his gold eyes searching her face, as though her consent actually mattered to him. Yes, she said quietly, I will come. He nodded once, satisfied, and turned to address the hall, his voice carrying easily over the murmuring crowd. The selection is complete. Mira Hollis will be presented to the kingdom as my chosen mate. Any who question my judgment may bring their concerns to me directly. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody dared. As Roran led her from the hall, his hand still wrapped firmly around hers, Mira caught sight of Seraphine Voss standing near the throne, her violet gown suddenly looking far too bright against the pale fury on her face. Seraphine's eyes met hers for only a moment, but in that moment Mira understood, with a certainty that settled cold in her stomach, that she had just made an enemy who would not forget this night, no matter how many years passed. Outside the hall, the night air was sharp and cold, and Mira could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears, as guards fell into formation around them, escorting them toward the waiting carriage that would carry her to the palace. She glanced sideways at Roran, studying the hard lines of his profile, the tension still visible in his jaw, even though the gold had begun to fade from his eyes, returning slowly to their usual gray. Why me? She asked, unable to hold the question back any longer. You do not know me. You have never spoken to me before tonight. Roran was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she wondered if he intended to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost hesitant, a tone she suspected very few people ever heard from him. My wolf recognized something in you the moment you walked into that hall, he said. Something I cannot yet explain, but I intend to find out exactly what it is. Mira said nothing, But as the carriage door opened and he helped her inside with a gentleness that surprised her, she found herself wondering the very same thing. What was it about her, the plainest girl at the ball, that had made a king abandon every expectation, every tradition, every carefully chosen bride his advisors had lined up for him, in favor of a girl nobody had ever bothered to notice? Whatever the answer was, she had a feeling her old life had ended the moment his golden eyes found hers across that crowded hall, and there was no going back to the quiet, invisible existence she had known before. The carriage pulled away from the palace grounds, carrying her toward a future she had never imagined, and could not yet understand, while behind her, in the golden light of the great hall, the whispers continued to spread, growing louder with every passing hour, until by morning, the entire kingdom would know that their king had chosen a girl nobody expected, and nobody, not even Mira herself, could say for certain what that choice would ultimately cost. The scream came from behind the tapestry, before Mira even had time to unpack the single trunk of belongings she had brought with her from her old life. She spun around, heart hammering, and found a young maid standing frozen near the doorway of her new chambers, staring at the floor where a silver tray had crashed and shattered, its contents of tea and honeyed bread scattered across the marble. "I am so sorry, my lady," the maid stammered, dropping into a hurried curtsy. "I did not mean to startle you. The tray simply slipped." Mira knelt down to help gather the broken pieces before the maid could stop her, and it was only as her fingers brushed against the shattered porcelain that she noticed the strange smell rising from the spilled tea, something bitter and sharp beneath the scent of honey, a smell that did not belong in a cup meant for drinking. "What is your name?" Mira asked quietly, setting the pieces aside instead of throwing them into the waste bin as she had first intended. "Lena, my lady." "Lena, did you prepare this tea yourself?" The maid's face went pale. "No, my lady, it was already prepared when I collected it from the kitchen to bring to you. I was only told to deliver it." Mira studied the girl's face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception, but found only genuine fear. She had been in the palace for less than a full day, and already something felt deeply wrong beneath the polished marble floors and gleaming chandeliers. She thought of the tea, of the bitter smell hiding beneath the sweetness, and a cold, uneasy feeling settled in her stomach. "Do not mention this to anyone," Mira said finally. "Not yet. I want to understand what happened before we cause alarm." Lena nodded quickly, relief flooding her young face, and hurried to clean the remaining mess while Mira sat on the edge of her enormous new bed, staring at her own hands. Only hours earlier she had been standing in a crowded ballroom, plain and unnoticed, and now she was sitting in chambers larger than her entire childhood home, already the target of something that felt uncomfortably close to danger. She did not see Roran again until the following morning, when a servant arrived to escort her to the private dining hall reserved for the royal family. He was already seated when she arrived, dressed simply in dark trousers and an unbuttoned shirt that made him look less like a king and more like an ordinary man who happened to carry an extraordinary amount of quiet authority in the set of his shoulders. "You did not sleep well," he said, not as a question but as an observation, before she had even taken her seat. "How could you tell? Your scent changes when you are tired. It grows heavier, slower." He gestured to the chair across from him, and she sat, still unused to the strange way he seemed to read her without effort, as though her body spoke a language his understood instinctively, even when her words did not. She hesitated before deciding to tell him about the tea. His expression darkened as she described the bitter smell, and he called for the kitchen staff to be questioned before she had even finished her sentence, his voice carrying an edge that made two nearby guards straighten immediately. "This will not happen again," he said once the servants had gone. "I will have every dish and drink brought to you, inspected from now on. You believe someone truly meant to harm me. I believe there are people in this palace who did not want you chosen, and who are unhappy that my wolf made a choice they cannot control." His jaw tightened. "You will need to be careful, Mira. Court is not always kind to those who rise quickly." She thought immediately of Lady Seraphine, of the fury barely hidden behind her composed expression the night before, but she said nothing, unwilling yet to accuse anyone without proof. Over the following days, Mira began to understand exactly how isolating palace life could be. She was given tutors to teach her the customs and history she had never needed to know before, dressmakers who measured her for gowns finer than anything she had ever touched, and advisors who spoke to her with careful, practiced courtesy that never quite reached their eyes. Everyone treated her with the correct formalities, and yet she often caught whispered conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room, and sideways glances that lingered a beat too long before sliding away. It was Lena, of all people, who became her only true companion in those early weeks. The young maid was assigned permanently to Mira's chambers, and though she was cautious at first, she gradually relaxed into an easy warmth that Mira found herself craving more than she expected. Lena had grown up within the palace grounds, the daughter of a longtime kitchen worker, and she seemed to understand instinctively how overwhelming the sudden change must feel. "They do not know what to make of you," Lena admitted one evening, as she helped Mira out of a heavily embroidered gown that had taken 3 fittings to complete. "You did not fight for the crown the way the others did. You did not scheme or bribe or promise favors. You simply existed, and the king chose you anyway. It frightens them, because they cannot understand it, and people always fear what they cannot understand." "I do not understand it either," Mira admitted quietly. Lena smiled, folding the gown carefully over her arm. Perhaps that is exactly why it happened. Mira turned the words over in her mind, long after Lena had gone, sitting alone by the window of her chambers, and watching the moon rise over the palace gardens. She thought of the strange pull she had felt the moment Roran's eyes found hers across the crowded hall, a sensation she still could not explain, and she thought too of the tea that had smelled wrong beneath its sweetness, and the whispers that fell silent whenever she entered a room. Lady Seraphine made her first open appearance 3 days later, arriving at the palace under the pretense of offering Mira congratulations, dressed in a gown of deep green that made her look every bit as elegant and composed as she had at the selection ball. She swept into the sitting room with a smile that did not reach her eyes and settled into a chair across from Mira as though they were old friends catching up after years apart. "You must be finding all of this rather overwhelming," Seraphine said, her voice smooth and pleasant, laced with just enough sympathy to sound sincere. "It is a great deal to absorb, especially for someone with your background. I only hope you are not finding the burden too heavy." "I am managing," Mira replied evenly, refusing to let the subtle insult land the way Seraphine clearly intended. "Of course. And should you ever find yourself unable to manage, I do hope you will consider the kindest option for everyone involved. The kingdom has certain expectations of its queen, expectations that some of us have spent our entire lives preparing to meet." Seraphine's smile widened slightly. "It would be a shame for those expectations to go unmet, simply because the king's wolf made an impulsive choice in a crowded room." The words were delivered so gently, so wrapped in false concern, that it took Mira a moment to fully understand the threat hidden inside them. She held Seraphine's gaze steadily, refusing to look away first. "I intend to meet every expectation placed upon me," Mira said quietly, "and I do not intend to step aside for anyone." Something flickered behind Seraphine's eyes. A flash of genuine anger quickly smoothed back into pleasant composure. "How admirable," she said, rising gracefully from her chair. "I look forward to seeing how well that intention holds." After Seraphine left, Mira sat alone for a long time, replaying the conversation in her mind, searching for the exact moment the pleasantries had turned into something sharper. She understood now, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her chest, that the tea incident had not been an isolated accident, and that whoever wanted her gone from the palace would not stop at whispered threats disguised as concern. That night, when Roran came to her chambers to discuss the following week's diplomatic events, she told him everything, watching his expression shift from careful neutrality to barely restrained anger as she recounted Seraphine's visit, word for word. "She threatened you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. She was careful with her words. Nothing she said could be proven as a direct threat. "I know exactly how careful Seraphine can be." He paced the length of the room, his movements sharp with contained frustration. "Her family has held influence in this court for generations. They expected her to be chosen. They are not accustomed to losing. What will you do?" He stopped pacing and turned to face her fully, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I will protect you," he said simply, "whatever it takes." Mira wanted to believe him completely, wanted to let herself lean into the strange, undeniable pull that had existed between them since the moment they met, but a small, cautious part of her held back, aware that she still knew almost nothing about the man she had been chosen to marry, or about the true reason his wolf had reacted so violently the moment she walked into that ballroom. She had accepted his hand that night without fully understanding what she was agreeing to, and now, standing in the growing shadows of palace intrigue, she found herself wondering exactly how much more remained hidden beneath the surface of her sudden, impossible new life. The dream came again on the seventh night, sharper this time than before, pulling Mira so deeply into sleep that she did not wake until dawn light was already spilling across her bedroom floor. In the dream, she stood in a forest she had never visited, surrounded by trees with silver bark that seemed to glow faintly under a moon, far too large and far too close, and a woman's voice called her name from somewhere she could not see, urgent and afraid, warning her to run before something found her. She woke gasping, her sheets damp with sweat, her heart pounding, as though she had truly been running through that strange silver forest only moments before. It was the fourth time in 2 weeks that the same dream had visited her, always different in its small details, but always ending the same way, with that unseen voice, crying out a warning she never understood in time. Lena found her sitting rigid on the edge of the bed when she arrived to open the curtains, and immediately set down the tray she carried to hurry to Mira's side. "Another dream," Lena said, not really a question. "The same one, always the same forest, always that voice." Mira pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. "It feels too real to be only a dream, Lena. I can smell the pine in the air. I can feel the cold ground beneath my feet." Lena's expression grew thoughtful, and she sat carefully beside Mira on the bed, an informality she rarely allowed herself, except in these quiet, private moments. "My grandmother used to say that some dreams are not truly dreams at all, but memories, trying to find their way back to us. Perhaps you have been to a place like that before, even if you cannot remember it. That is impossible. I have never left the village where I grew up, not once in my entire life, until the night of the ball." "Perhaps not in this life," Lena said quietly, and though she offered no further explanation, the words settled uneasily in Mira's chest, refusing to be dismissed as easily as she wanted them to be. She mentioned the dreams to Roran later that day, watching carefully for his reaction as she described the silver forest and the frightened voice calling her name. He grew very still as she spoke, his expression carefully controlled, in a way that told her he was working hard to hide something. "Have you had these dreams before you came to the palace?" he asked finally. "No, they began only after the ball." He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window of his study at the gardens below, his jaw working, as though he were fighting some internal battle over what to say next. Mira watched him, growing increasingly certain that he knew something about her strange dreams that he had not yet shared with her. "Roran," she said carefully, "if there is something you know about why this is happening to me, I need you to tell me. I cannot keep wondering in silence while everyone around me seems to know more about my own life than I do." He turned to face her then, and for the first time since she had arrived at the palace, she saw something close to guilt flicker across his features. "There are things I have not told you," he admitted. "Things I was waiting to be certain of before I burdened you with them. But you deserve honesty, and I have given you far too little of it." Her stomach tightened with a mixture of dread and relief. "Then tell me now." He gestured for her to sit, and settled into the chair across from her, his hands clasped tightly together, as though bracing himself for whatever came next. "When my wolf reacted to you at the ball, it was not simply attraction, or even the pull of fated mates that some couples experience. It was recognition. My wolf knew your scent before you ever walked into that hall, though neither of us understood why at the time. How is that possible? There is an old prophecy, one my family has guarded for generations, spoken of only among the ruling line, and never shared publicly. It speaks of a bloodline thought lost to time, a line capable of breaking a curse that has haunted every alpha king of Veyrath for as long as anyone can remember." He paused, watching her carefully. "Every king in my family line has died young, Mira. My father did not live to see his 40th year. Neither did his father before him, nor his father before that. We have always believed it to be misfortune, or perhaps the burden of leadership itself, but the prophecy claims otherwise. It claims we are cursed, and that only one bloodline holds the power to end it." Mira felt the blood drain from her face. "And you believe I belong to that bloodline?" I believe it is possible. More than possible. He leaned forward, his gray eyes intent on hers. The moment I saw you, my wolf recognized something in your scent that matched the old descriptions passed down through my family for centuries. I did not choose you at random, Mira, though I did not fully understand my own actions in that moment either. Something ancient in me knew exactly who you were before I did. She sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb everything he had just told her, the dream suddenly taking on new and unsettling significance. If what he said was true, then the silver forest that haunted her sleep, the frightened voice calling her name, might not be simple dreams at all, but fragments of memory belonging to a heritage she had never known she carried. Why would I not know this about my own family? She asked finally. My mother never spoke of anything like this. She raised me in the smallest, most ordinary village imaginable. If I truly belonged to some ancient bloodline, surely she would have told me. Perhaps she hid it from you deliberately, Roran said gently. If your bloodline truly holds the power to end the curse, there are those who would see that as a threat rather than a gift. Powerful forces have hunted bloodlines like yours before, hoping to prevent the prophecy from ever being fulfilled. Your mother may have hidden your heritage precisely to protect you. The idea settled over Mira like a heavy blanket, uncomfortable and suffocating. She thought of her mother, of the quiet, careful way she had always avoided questions about their family history, of the small, worn pendant she had worn every day of her life and had pressed into Mira's hands on her deathbed, with instructions never to remove it. Mira touched the pendant now, hidden beneath the collar of her gown, and wondered for the first time whether it held more significance than simple sentiment. I need to understand more, she said quietly. I need to know what I actually am, Roran, not just what a prophecy claims I might be. I will help you find those answers, he promised. Whatever it takes, whatever records still exist within this palace, or beyond it, we will find them together. She studied his face, searching for any remaining trace of deception, and found instead something that looked remarkably like relief, as though confessing the truth had lifted a weight he had been carrying since the moment they met. She still did not fully trust the strange pull between them, still did not know whether what she felt for him was genuine affection or simply the pull of forces neither of them fully understood. But she found herself grateful, at least, that the secrecy between them had finally begun to crack open. There is something else, Roran said, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. The bond forming between us, the pull you likely feel as strongly as I do, it will only grow stronger the longer we remain close. If you are truly who I believe you to be, that bond may eventually reveal abilities in you that you do not yet understand, abilities tied to the old bloodline itself. I do not say this to frighten you, only to prepare you for what may come. Mira thought of the strange warmth that sometimes stirred in her chest when Roran stood near her, the way her senses occasionally sharpened without explanation, catching scents and sounds she should not have been able to notice. She had dismissed these moments as simple nervousness, the natural result of adjusting to an unfamiliar life, but now she wondered whether they were something else entirely, the first faint stirrings of a power she had not yet learned to recognize. I am not afraid, she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. I would rather understand what I truly am than continue living in ignorance while everyone around me whispers half-truths behind my back. Something shifted in Roran's expression, admiration mixing with the relief already present there, and he reached across the small distance between them to take her hand in his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. Then we will face it together, he said. Whatever the prophecy holds, whatever truth your bloodline carries, you will not face it alone. Mira held onto those words as tightly as she held onto his hand, drawing strength from the quiet certainty in his voice, even as a small, persistent unease lingered at the edges of her thoughts. If the prophecy was real, if her bloodline truly held the power to break a curse that had haunted his family for generations, then there were forces in the world far more dangerous than a jealous noblewoman with poisoned tea and cutting words. Forces that had hunted bloodlines like hers before, and would not hesitate to hunt her as well, now that her identity had finally been revealed within the walls of a palace that clearly held more secrets and more enemies than she had ever imagined. The old trunk had been sitting untouched in the corner of Mira's childhood cottage for as long as she could remember, its lock rusted shut, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. Roran had arranged for it to be brought to the palace within days of their conversation, along with every other belonging Mira's mother had left behind, and now it sat open on the floor of her chambers, its contents spread carefully across the carpet, while Lena helped her sort through faded letters and yellowed fabric. "This was not here before," Lena said suddenly, holding up a small wooden box, hidden beneath a false bottom in the trunk, that neither of them had noticed, until the old wood finally gave way under careful prying. Inside, wrapped in a strip of soft cloth, lay a bundle of letters, tied together with fraying string, along with a second pendant, nearly identical to the one Mira already wore around her neck. Mira's hands trembled slightly as she untied the string and unfolded the first letter, recognizing her mother's careful handwriting immediately, though the ink had faded with age into a soft brown that was difficult to read in places. The letter was addressed not to Mira, but to someone named Edwin, and it spoke of danger, of hiding, of a child who needed to be protected from forces that would not stop searching until they found her. "They came again last night," Mira read aloud, her voice growing unsteady. "I do not know how much longer I can keep her hidden. The pendant will protect her from being sensed by those who hunt our line, but it will not protect her forever, and I fear the day is coming when she will need to know the truth of what she carries, whether she is ready or not." Lena had gone very still beside her, listening intently, as Mira continued reading through letter after letter, each one painting a clearer picture of a mother, desperate to protect a daughter from a danger she had never once mentioned aloud. The letters spoke of a bloodline called the Moonborn, an ancient line said to carry the blood of the very first wolves, blessed with abilities long thought extinct, abilities capable of ending curses that ordinary wolves could never touch. "She never told me any of this," Mira whispered, setting the last letter down with hands that would not stop shaking. "My entire life, and she never once gave any indication that we were anything other than ordinary." "She was protecting you," Lena said gently, "just as the letters say." Mira picked up the second pendant, studying its intricate silver design, so similar to her own that they might have been carved by the same hand. She had worn her own pendant every day since her mother's death, believing it to be nothing more than a sentimental keepsake, and now, she understood it had been shielding her from forces that had hunted her family for generations, forces she had never known existed, until she stepped into a crowded ballroom and caught the attention of a cursed king. She brought the letters to Roran that same evening, watching his expression grow increasingly grave as he read through them himself, his fingers tracing carefully over her mother's faded handwriting. "Moonborn," he said quietly, almost reverently. "I had heard the name only in the oldest texts, references so ancient that most scholars believe the bloodline to be nothing more than legend. If your mother truly believed you carried Moonborn blood, and if she went to such lengths to hide and protect you, then the prophecy is almost certainly true." "Who is Edwin?" Mira asked. "The letters are addressed to him. He may know more about what happened to my mother, about why she was being hunted." Roran's brow furrowed in thought. "There is an advisor within my own court named Edwin, an elderly man who has served 3 generations of my family. He has always been secretive about his past, and I never thought to question it. If he is the same man your mother wrote to, he may hold answers neither of us currently possess." They summoned Edwin to Roran's private study that same night, and the moment the elderly advisor's eyes landed on the bundle of letters resting on the desk, his composed expression cracked, revealing a depth of grief he had clearly kept hidden for many years. "You knew my mother," Mira said, watching the old man carefully. Edwin lowered himself slowly into a chair, his hands trembling as he reached for one of the letters, running his thumb gently over the faded ink. "I knew her very well," he admitted. "Your mother, Clara, was once one of the most gifted young women in this very court, before she disappeared without explanation, nearly 20 years ago. I searched for her for years afterward, fearing the worst, until finally I was forced to accept that she had chosen to vanish rather than face whatever danger had driven her away. She was protecting me," Mira said quietly. "According to her letters, someone was hunting our bloodline." Edwin nodded slowly, his eyes distant with old memory. There were rumors, even then, whispered carefully among those who studied the ancient prophecies. A faction within the northern packs believed the Moonborn bloodline posed a threat to their own ambitions, particularly to those who benefited from the curse remaining unbroken. Breaking the curse would mean a king who lived a full and natural life, a king strong enough to hold power far longer than his predecessors, and there were those who profited greatly from the instability caused by each king's early death. Mira felt a chill move through her. Who would benefit from a king dying young? Rival packs seeking to seize territory during periods of weak leadership, Edwin said grimly. Ambitious nobles hoping to install a more easily influenced ruler. There are many who have quietly profited from the curse over the generations, Mira, and I fear some of them still hold significant influence within this very court. Roran's expression darkened considerably. Seraphine's family has grown remarkably wealthy over the past several generations, wealth that has always been attributed to shrewd trade agreements. But her family has also maintained close ties with several of the northern rival packs, ties that have always struck me as unusually friendly, given our historical tensions with those territories. You believe Seraphine is working with them, Mira said. I believe it is worth investigating, Roran said carefully. If her family has profited from the instability caused by my line's curse, she would have every reason to want you removed before you could break it. Edwin's expression grew troubled. There is more you should know. Your mother did not simply flee out of fear, Mira. She fled because someone within this very palace betrayed her location to those hunting the Moonborn line. She barely escaped with her life, and with yours, though you were only an infant at the time. I have always wondered who among the court could have betrayed her trust so completely, but I never uncovered proof. Mira absorbed this new information slowly, feeling the pieces of her scattered, uncertain life beginning to align into a shape far larger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She was not simply a plain village girl who had caught a king's eye by strange chance. She was the last remaining thread of an ancient bloodline, hunted for generations by forces still active within the very palace she now called home. Forces that had already tried once to poison her tea, and would surely try again, with far more determination now that Roran had confirmed her identity, at least within their small, private circle. We need to find proof, Mira said firmly. If Seraphine or her family are truly connected to those who hunted my mother, we need evidence before we can act. I will begin investigating quietly, Edwin said, rising from his chair with renewed purpose, despite his age. I owe your mother that much, and far more besides. She was dear to me, Mira, in ways I never had the chance to properly express before she vanished. I will not fail her daughter the way I failed her all those years ago. After Edwin departed, Mira remained in Roran's study for a long while, staring at the scattered letters that had rewritten everything she believed about her own life. Roran watched her quietly, giving her the space to process the weight of everything she had learned, until finally he moved to sit beside her, his presence steady and grounding, in a way she had come to rely on more than she wanted to admit. This is a great deal to carry, he said softly. It is, she agreed. But I would rather know the truth, however dangerous it may be, than continue living in the comfortable ignorance I had before. My mother spent her entire life hiding from something she never let me see. I do not intend to hide the same way. Roran studied her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering behind his eyes. You are stronger than you realize, Mira Hollis. I am only beginning to understand what I truly am, she replied. But whatever it is, whatever danger comes with it, I intend to face it standing upright, not cowering in some hidden corner the way my mother was forced to. Outside the study window, the moon had risen full and bright over the palace gardens, and Mira found herself thinking of the silver forest from her dreams, of the frightened voice that had always warned her to run. For the first time since the dreams began, she understood that the voice belonged to her mother, calling out across years and distance to warn a daughter who had not yet been ready to listen. Now, finally, she was ready, and she intended to uncover every remaining secret her mother had died protecting, no matter how many enemies stood waiting in the shadows to stop her. The diplomatic summit at Greymore Hall was meant to be a simple gathering, a chance for the northern pacts to renew old trade agreements, and for Mira to be formally introduced to allied leaders as the future queen of Veyrath. Instead, within an hour of her arrival, Mira found herself standing in a crowded reception room, watching Alpha Harold Prescott of the Ironwood Pack study her, with an intensity that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. Harold was a broad, heavily built man with a scar running down one side of his jaw, and he approached her with a smile that did not match the calculating look in his eyes, moving through the crowded room with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. "So you are the girl who has caused such a stir among the northern courts," he said, his voice pleasant enough on the surface, though something colder ran beneath it. I confess I expected someone rather different, given all the talk. I am not certain what talk you mean, Alpha Prescott, Mira replied carefully, aware of Roran standing only a few feet away, deep in conversation with another visiting leader, but clearly watching her from the corner of his eye. Merely that the king's sudden and unexpected choice has generated a great deal of speculation, Harold said smoothly. Some believe it was fate, others believe it was something else entirely. I find myself curious which explanation proves true. Before Mira could respond, a sharp cry rang out from the far side of the room, followed immediately by the crash of an overturned table and the panicked shouts of several guests. Mira turned just in time to see a servant collapse to the floor, clutching his throat, his face rapidly turning a mottled shade of purple that sent the entire hall into instant chaos. Roran was at her side within seconds, pulling her firmly away from the crowd as guards rushed toward the fallen servant, shouting for a healer. Mira's pulse pounded in her ears as she watched the scene unfold, and it took her only a moment to recognize the pattern of what she was seeing. The same bitter smell she had detected in her own poisoned tea weeks earlier, now hanging faintly in the air near the overturned refreshment table. That drink was meant for me, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the surrounding panic. I was standing near that table only minutes ago. That servant must have picked it up by mistake, thinking it was meant for the general refreshments. Roran's face went pale with barely controlled fury. Someone tried to poison you in the middle of a diplomatic summit, surrounded by leaders from every allied pack in the north. Whoever did this either does not care about the risk of being caught, or believes themselves untouchable enough that the risk does not matter, Mira said, her mind racing even as her hands trembled at her sides. The healer arrived quickly enough to save the servant's life, though the man remained gravely ill for several days afterward, and the summit dissolved into a flurry of accusations and denials as guards questioned every kitchen worker and servant who had been near the refreshment table that evening. No clear culprit emerged, though Mira noticed, with growing unease, that Lady Seraphine had been conspicuously absent from the reception room during the crucial moments before the poisoning occurred, claiming afterward that she had stepped outside for fresh air. Edwin arrived at the palace 3 days after the summit, his expression grim as he requested a private meeting with both Mira and Roran. He carried with him a small ledger, its pages filled with careful notes he had gathered during his quiet investigation into Seraphine's family finances. I have found something troubling, he said, spreading the ledger open across Roran's desk. Over the past 5 years, Seraphine's family has received substantial payments from a trading company based in Ironwood territory, payments far larger than any legitimate trade agreement would justify. The timing of these payments correlates closely with several periods of instability within our own court, including the illness that claimed your father's life 2 years earlier than expected, Your Majesty. Roran's expression turned to stone. You believe Seraphine's family had a hand in my father's death. I cannot yet prove it conclusively, Edwin admitted, but the pattern is deeply suspicious, and it aligns precisely with what I feared when I began investigating the possibility of a connection between Seraphine and the forces that hunted Mira's mother all those years ago. Alpha Prescott of Ironwood has long harbored ambitions of expanding his territory into Veyrath's northern borders. A weakened, unstable throne would serve his interests considerably. Mira felt the pieces settling into place with sickening clarity. Seraphine and Harold are working together. It would explain a great deal, Roran said grimly. Her family profits from our instability, and in exchange, they may have been feeding Ironwood information about our court, perhaps even actively working to ensure the curse remained unbroken by removing any threat to its continuation, which would now include you. We still lack solid proof, Edwin cautioned. Suspicion alone will not be enough to move against a noble family, with Seraphine's standing and connections. If we accuse her without irrefutable evidence, we risk turning the court against us, particularly given how unconventional Mira's selection already appeared to many nobles. Roran paced the length of his study, his frustration evident in every sharp movement. Then we need proof, real proof, something undeniable enough to expose her before the entire court. I may have an idea, Mira said slowly, an idea forming in her mind that made her stomach tighten with apprehension, even as she spoke it aloud. If Seraphine believes I remain unaware of her involvement, she may grow careless, particularly if she believes another opportunity has presented itself. What if we gave her that opportunity, under circumstances we control? Roran turned to face her, his expression torn between admiration and clear reluctance. You are suggesting we use yourself as bait. I am suggesting we stop waiting for her to strike again on her own terms, Mira said firmly. She has already tried twice to remove me, once quietly with poisoned tea, and once boldly enough to risk an entire diplomatic summit. She will try again. I would rather it happen somewhere we control, where we can catch her in the act, than continue living in constant fear of the next attempt. It is far too dangerous, Roran said, his voice tight with barely restrained emotion. I will not risk your life on a plan built around exposing yourself to further harm. Roran, Mira said gently, reaching for his hand, I cannot spend the rest of my life hiding behind guards and locked doors, waiting for the next attempt to come. If my bloodline is truly meant to break this curse, then I need to face this danger directly, not shrink away from it. Please trust me enough to let me try. He studied her for a long moment, the internal battle playing openly across his features, torn between his instinct to protect her at all costs and his growing respect for her determination to face the danger on her own terms. Finally, with visible reluctance, he nodded. We will plan this carefully, he said. Every possible precaution. I will not lose you to this, Mira, not after everything it took to find you. Edwin helped them devise the plan over the following days, a carefully orchestrated gathering that would appear to be an ordinary evening reception, but would include enough guards positioned discreetly throughout the palace grounds to intervene the moment any threat presented itself. Lena, sworn to secrecy, agreed to help monitor the kitchens for any sign of tampering, while Edwin quietly informed only the most trusted members of the court, hoping to keep the plan hidden from anyone who might warn Seraphine in advance. As the evening of the reception approached, Mira found herself standing before her mirror, studying her own reflection, with a steadiness she would not have recognized in the plain, overlooked girl who had attended the selection ball only weeks earlier. She touched the pendant at her throat, thinking of her mother's letters, of the courage it must have taken to flee everything she knew in order to protect her daughter, and she felt a fierce, determined resolve settle over her, chasing away the last remnants of fear. Whatever Seraphine and Harold had planned, whatever danger still waited in the shadows of the court, Mira intended to meet it head-on, not as the plain, forgettable girl the nobles had once dismissed without a second glance, but as a woman finally beginning to understand the full weight and power of the bloodline she carried within her. The reception hall glowed with warm candlelight as guests arrived in a steady stream, unaware that nearly every servant weaving quietly through the crowd carrying trays of wine and delicacies was actually a guard in disguise, watching every movement with practiced, careful eyes. Mira stood near the center of the room in a gown of deep blue, doing her best to appear relaxed and unaware, though her pulse hammered steadily beneath her calm exterior. Seraphine arrived fashionably late, sweeping into the hall in a gown of pale gold that drew admiring glances from every direction, her expression composed into the same pleasant mask she always wore in public. She made her way toward Mira with practiced grace, offering the kind of polite conversation that had become their strange, tense ritual over the past weeks. You look well, Seraphine said, so sweeping briefly over Mira's gown. Palace life appears to suit you, despite everything. I have adjusted, Mira replied evenly, though I confess the past weeks have not been without their difficulties. Difficulties, Seraphine repeated, something flickering behind her eyes. How unfortunate. I do hope nothing serious has troubled you. Mira held her gaze steadily, watching for any crack in the woman's composed exterior. Nothing I could not handle, though I understand the summit at Greymore Hall proved rather eventful for everyone. Something tightened almost imperceptibly around Seraphine's mouth. A terrible accident. I understand the servant has recovered, thankfully. Thankfully, Mira echoed, and for a long moment the two women simply studied each other, the pleasant surface of their conversation stretched thin over the sharp tension running underneath. The evening continued without incident for nearly 2 hours, long enough that Mira began to wonder whether their plan had failed entirely, whether Seraphine had somehow grown suspicious and chosen to hold back. Then, near the far end of the hall, Mira caught sight of Seraphine slipping quietly through a side door that led toward the palace kitchens, moving with a purpose that immediately caught Mira's attention. She followed at a careful distance, trusting the guards stationed throughout the corridor to remain close without revealing themselves too soon. The kitchen corridor was dim and mostly empty at this hour, the main kitchen staff occupied with the ongoing reception, and Mira pressed herself against the shadowed wall as she watched Seraphine meet with a figure she did not immediately recognize, a thin man dressed in traveling clothes rather than palace livery. "The wine for the Queen's private toast," Seraphine's voice carried quietly down the corridor. "It needs to be delivered before the final course. Are you certain the dose is untraceable?" "Completely," the stranger replied. "It will appear as nothing more than a sudden weakness of the heart, entirely natural, entirely believable given the stress of recent events." Mira's blood ran cold, but she forced herself to remain still, waiting for the signal that Edwin had arranged with the hidden guards. A moment later, torches flared to life along the corridor as guards emerged from their hiding places, surrounding both Seraphine and her accomplice before either could react. Seraphine's composed mask shattered instantly, fury and panic replacing the careful pleasantness she had maintained for weeks. "This is a misunderstanding," she said sharply, though her eyes betrayed her the moment they landed on Mira, stepping out from the shadows. "I do not know what you believe you overheard, but—" "I heard everything," Mira said quietly, stepping forward despite her racing heart. "I heard you arranged to poison me during tonight's reception, just as you arranged the poisoning at Greymore Hall, and the tea that arrived in my chambers on my very first night in this palace." Seraphine's expression cycled rapidly through denial, calculation, and finally something closer to desperate resignation, as guards moved to restrain the stranger beside her, who immediately began babbling frantic explanations in an attempt to save himself, revealing far more than Seraphine likely wished him to share. "She paid me through intermediaries," the man said quickly, his eyes wide with fear. "I never met her directly before tonight, only received instructions and payment through Ironwood contacts. I know nothing of any larger plan, I swear it. I was only paid to deliver the poison." Roran arrived moments later, having been summoned the instant the guards revealed themselves, his expression darkening with barely controlled fury as he took in the scene before him. He crossed the corridor in several long strides, stopping directly in front of Seraphine, who had gone pale beneath her composed exterior. "You tried to poison my chosen mate," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Not once, but 3 times. Working in league with Ironwood to see her dead." "Your Majesty," Seraphine began, her voice trembling now, "I only sought to protect the kingdom from a threat I believed." "Do not," Roran cut her off sharply, "insult me further with false claims of protecting this kingdom. You sought to protect your own family's profit, built on generations of instability that your family helped cause. Guards, take her to the tower. She will remain there until a full inquiry can be conducted before the entire court." As guards led Seraphine away, her earlier composure fully collapsed into furious protests that echoed down the corridor long after she disappeared from sight. Mira felt a wave of relief wash over her so powerful, it left her slightly unsteady on her feet. Roran was at her side instantly, his hand steadying her elbow, his eyes searching her face with visible concern. "Are you unharmed?" he asked quietly. "I am fine," she said, though her voice shook slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. "It is finally over. Whatever she planned, whatever Ironwood hoped to accomplish, it is finally exposed." But even as she spoke the words, a small, uneasy feeling lingered at the edge of her thoughts, a suspicion that the danger surrounding her had not fully ended simply because Seraphine had been caught. Harold Prescott remained free, his involvement suspected but not yet proven beyond the desperate claims of a captured poisoner. And Mira could not shake the feeling that a man ambitious enough to arrange the death of a king's chosen mate would not simply accept defeat now that one piece of his scheme had unraveled. That feeling proved correct far sooner than she expected. Only 2 days later, as Mira walked through the palace gardens with Lena in the soft afternoon light, a horn sounded sharply from the outer walls, followed immediately by shouts of alarm rippling through the palace grounds. Guards rushed past them toward the main gate, and Mira felt an icy dread settle over her even before Edwin arrived, breathless and pale, to deliver the news. "Ironwood forces have been sighted approaching the northern border," he said, struggling to catch his breath. "Alpha Prescott has declared open hostility against the crown, claiming the king unjustly imprisoned Lady Seraphine without proper cause. He marches with a significant force, Your Majesty. and he has made no secret of his true intentions. Mira's heart pounded as Roran arrived moments later, already dressed for war. His expression hardened into the fierce, commanding presence of a king, preparing to defend his kingdom. He crossed the garden quickly, his eyes finding Mira's with an intensity that spoke louder than words. "This is only the beginning of what he truly intends," Roran said grimly. "Prescott does not care about Seraphine's imprisonment. He cares about removing you, before the prophecy can be fulfilled, and he intends to use this war as cover to reach you directly." "Then we face him together," Mira said firmly, though fear coiled tightly in her chest at the thought of the danger now bearing down upon them both. Roran's expression softened briefly, admiration flickering behind the hardened resolve in his eyes. "Together," he agreed, "but you must promise me you will remain cautious, Mira. Prescott is not like Seraphine, working quietly through poison and shadow. He is a warrior, direct and ruthless, and he will not hesitate to strike at you the moment he sees an opening." Mira nodded, though even as she made the promise, a small, determined voice within her whispered that whatever power her moonborn bloodline carried, whatever ancient strength waited dormant within her, the time to discover it fully had finally arrived, because the danger closing in around them now was far greater than anything a poisoned cup of tea could ever hope to accomplish. The War Council met through the night, maps spread across every available surface of the Great Hall, as Roran and his generals debated strategy, while messengers arrived continuously, with fresh reports of Ironwood's advancing forces. Mira sat near the edge of the room, listening carefully, absorbing every detail, even as the weight of the coming conflict pressed heavily against her chest. "Prescott's forces are moving faster than expected," General Colin Ashford reported, tracing a line across the northern border on the largest map. "He appears to be avoiding direct engagement with our border patrols, moving instead toward the eastern pass, which would bring him dangerously close to Willowmere, before we could properly intercept him." "Willowmere holds no strategic value," another advisor said, frowning at the map. "Why would he risk exposing his flank to reach such an insignificant village?" Roran's eyes met Mira's across the room, and she saw the answer settle over him at the same moment it occurred to her. "Willowmere is where the diplomatic delegation is scheduled to meet tomorrow morning," he said grimly. "The peace summit I arranged weeks ago, before any of this began, intended to renew our alliance with the Western Pax." "You believe he intends to intercept the summit," Colin said. "I believe he intends to reach Mira," Roran said, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "The summit provides the perfect opportunity, a gathering he could claim to attend legitimately, while positioning his forces close enough to strike." Despite Roran's immediate objections, the Western Pack leaders refused to postpone the summit on such short notice, unwilling to appear weak or easily intimidated by Ironwood's aggression. After hours of tense negotiation, it was decided that Mira would attend under heavy guard, surrounded by nearly triple the usual protective escort, while Roran remained close at all times, rather than dividing his attention between the summit and the ongoing military preparations. The journey to Willowmere passed without incident, the small village nestled peacefully in a valley that gave no outward indication of the danger supposedly approaching from the north. Mira stood beside Roran throughout the morning's proceedings, watching carefully for any sign of trouble among the gathered delegates, her senses stretched taut with anticipation that made even the quiet rustle of leaves outside the meeting hall feel significant. It happened during the midday recess, when the delegates dispersed briefly to take refreshments in the village square. Mira had stepped away from the main gathering only long enough to speak quietly with Lena, who had insisted on accompanying her despite the danger, when a sudden, sharp whistle cut through the air, followed immediately by chaos erupting on every side. Smoke bombs detonated near the eastern edge of the square, filling the air with thick, choking clouds that sent guards scrambling in confusion, unable to see clearly enough to distinguish friend from enemy. Mira felt strong hands grip her arms from behind before she could react, dragging her backward through the smoke, while Lena's frightened cry rang out somewhere behind her, quickly muffled and cut short. "Let go of me," Mira demanded, struggling fiercely against the grip holding her, but her attacker was far stronger, hauling her through the confusion with practiced efficiency, toward a waiting horse, just beyond the village edge. She caught one final glimpse of Roran through the thinning smoke, his face contorted with fury and desperation as he fought his way through the chaos toward her, cutting down anyone who stood in his path. but he was too far, the distance between them widening with every passing second, as her captor forced her onto the waiting horse and spurred it into a hard gallop away from the village. "You will not escape this easily," Mira said through gritted teeth, twisting against the ropes that bound her wrists as the horse thundered through the forest, the village growing smaller behind them. The man holding the reins said nothing, his face hidden beneath a dark hood, though Mira caught the flash of ironwood colors beneath his cloak as the wind pulled it briefly aside. They rode hard for what felt like hours, the forest growing thicker and darker around them, until finally they arrived at a fortified camp hidden deep within the woods, where Alpha Harold Prescott himself stood waiting, his scarred face split into a satisfied smile as Mira was dragged from the horse and forced to her knees before him. "Welcome, Lady Hollis," Harold said, his voice carrying the same false pleasantness Seraphine had once used, though far more menacing given the armed warriors surrounding them on every side. "I must say, you have caused a remarkable amount of trouble for someone so unremarkable in appearance." "Roran will come for me," Mira said, refusing to let fear tremble in her voice, despite the terror coiling tightly in her chest. "You have made a grave mistake, Prescott." "On the contrary," Harold said, crouching down to her level, his eyes studying her with cold calculation. "I have made exactly the move I should have made from the very beginning, rather than relying on Seraphine's clumsy attempts with poison. You, my dear, are the key to a curse my family has profited from for generations, and I do not intend to let a plain village girl unravel everything my ancestors worked so carefully to build." "The curse harms everyone," Mira said. "Innocent people suffer under unstable leadership. You would sacrifice countless lives simply to protect your own profit." Harold's smile widened, cold and humorless. "The world has always belonged to those willing to make difficult choices, Lady Hollis. I suggest you grow accustomed to your new circumstances, because you will remain my guest until I decide precisely what to do with you, and King Ashgard's forces will not find this camp easily, hidden as it is." He rose and turned to give orders to his men, leaving Mira bound and kneeling on the cold ground, her mind racing through every possible option, even as despair threatened to overwhelm the fierce determination burning steadily beneath her fear. She thought of her mother's letters, of the courage it had taken to flee and hide for years to protect her. And she thought too of Roran's face in that final glimpse through the smoke, fighting desperately to reach her. Whatever power her moonborn bloodline carried, whatever ancient strength remained dormant within her, she understood now, kneeling helpless in an enemy camp deep within the forest, that the time to discover it could wait no longer. She closed her eyes, reaching inward toward the strange warmth she had felt stirring occasionally in her chest since the bond with Roran had first begun to form, searching desperately for whatever hidden strength her bloodline had left buried within her, praying it would answer before it was too late. Night fell heavily over the hidden camp, and Mira remained bound inside a small canvas tent at its center, guarded by two warriors, who took turns watching her with bored, indifferent expressions. She had spent the hours since her capture carefully studying every detail of her surroundings, noting the positions of the guards, the layout of the camp, the location of the horses tethered near the northern edge, gathering every piece of information that might prove useful should an opportunity for escape present itself. The warmth she had reached for earlier remained frustratingly distant, a faint flicker she could sense but not fully grasp, like trying to hold onto a flame with hands that refused to close properly around it. She closed her eyes again, breathing slowly, trying to recall every strange sensation she had experienced since her bond with Roran began. The sharpened senses, the occasional pull toward things she should not have been able to perceive, searching for the thread that connected those small moments to whatever larger power lay dormant within her blood. A commotion outside the tent pulled her from her concentration, and she opened her eyes just as the tent flap was thrown aside, revealing Harold standing in the opening, his expression tight with barely controlled frustration. "Your king has found us faster than expected," he said, his earlier confidence noticeably diminished. "His forces are moving through the forest even now. We will be relocating you immediately." He gestured sharply to the guards, who hauled Mira to her feet and began dragging her toward the edge of the camp, where a fresh horse waited. In the distance, Mira could hear the faint sounds of fighting beginning to break out, shouts and the clash of steel echoing through the trees, and hope flared bright and fierce in her chest, despite the danger still surrounding her. She used the momentary chaos of the camp's hurried evacuation to her advantage, twisting suddenly against the guard holding her arm, driving her elbow backward into his ribs, with more force than she expected herself capable of producing. He staggered, his grip loosening just enough for her to wrench herself free, and she ran, her bound wrists making balance difficult, but not impossible as she sprinted toward the tree line, away from the camp, and toward the sounds of battle drawing steadily closer. Shouts rose up behind her as her escape was discovered, and she heard the heavy footfalls of pursuit crashing through the underbrush, gaining on her with alarming speed. She pushed herself harder, lungs burning, branches tearing at her gown as she wove desperately between the trees, until finally a hand closed around her shoulder and yanked her backward, sending her stumbling to the forest floor. She rolled onto her back to find one of Harold's warriors looming over her, his sword already drawn, his expression coldly determined despite the chaos of the ongoing attack surrounding the camp. Mira scrambled backward, her bound hands scrabbling uselessly against the ground, and in that moment of pure, desperate fear, something inside her finally shattered open. The warmth she had been reaching for all evening surged through her without warning, spreading from her chest outward through her limbs, with a force that made her gasp aloud. Her vision sharpened dramatically, every detail of the moonlit forest suddenly vivid and clear, and the ropes binding her wrists seemed to loosen and fray, as though her very skin had grown warm enough to weaken the fibers. She tore her hands free just as the warrior lunged toward her, and instinct took over completely, guiding her body in a way she had never been taught, rolling aside from the blade's downward arc, with a speed and precision that felt entirely foreign to the plain village girl she had been only weeks earlier. She came up in a crouch, and when the warrior turned to strike again, she caught his wrist with both hands, and the moment her skin made contact with his, a pulse of silver light flared outward from her palms, throwing him backward with a force that sent him crashing hard against a nearby tree, where he slumped to the ground, unconscious. Mira stared down at her own trembling hands, silver light still flickering faintly along her fingertips, before fading slowly back into ordinary skin. She had no time to process what had just happened, no time to understand the strange new power now coursing through her veins, because more shouts were closing in from every direction, and the sounds of battle had grown close enough that she could see flashes of steel between the trees ahead. She ran toward the fighting rather than away from it, some instinct guiding her forward even as fear and confusion warred within her chest. She broke through the tree line into a small clearing, where Roran fought fiercely against 3 of Harold's warriors simultaneously, his movements a blur of controlled violence, his wolf clearly close to the surface given the golden intensity of his eyes even in human form. "Roran," she called out, and his head snapped toward the sound of her voice, relief and fury crossing his features in the same instant, before he redirected his focus to finish the fight before him, with brutal efficiency, sending his final opponent stumbling backward, before the man turned and fled into the darkness. Roran crossed the clearing in several long strides, and pulled her into his arms so tightly she could barely breathe, his hands moving over her shoulders and face, as though checking for injuries even as his voice came out rough with barely restrained emotion. "I thought I had lost you," he said, his forehead pressing against hers. "The moment they took you from Willowmere, I thought." "I am here," she said, her voice steadier than she expected given everything that had just happened. "I am here, and I am unharmed." He pulled back just enough to study her face, and something in his expression shifted as he noticed the faint traces of silver light still lingering at the edges of her fingertips, not yet fully faded. "What happened?" "I do not fully understand it myself," she admitted, "but I believe my bloodline has finally begun to answer, Roran. Whatever power the Moonborn line carries, I felt it stir tonight, strong enough to save my own life." Before he could respond, a horn sounded from somewhere deeper in the forest, and General Colin appeared at the edge of the clearing, breathless and urgent. "Your Majesty, Prescott's forces are retreating toward the northern border. Shall we pursue?" Roran hesitated only a moment before shaking his head. "No. Our priority is getting Mira safely back to the palace. Prescott has shown his true intentions tonight, and we will deal with him properly, once we have gathered our full strength, rather than chasing him through unfamiliar territory in the dark." As they made their way back through the forest, toward the waiting escort, Mira found Lena waiting anxiously among the rescued delegates, tears of relief streaming down her face, as she embraced Mira tightly, both of them shaking from the events of the night. Mira held onto her friend, grateful beyond words that Lena had survived the chaos unharmed, even as her mind continued to race through everything that had just happened, the strange silver power still humming faintly beneath her skin, waiting to be understood. Whatever the moonborn bloodline truly was, whatever ancient strength her mother had spent her entire life hiding and protecting, Mira understood now, walking beside Roran through the moonlit forest with her hand held firmly in his, that the power was finally awake within her, and she would need to master it quickly, because Harold Prescott remained free, his ambitions unbroken despite tonight's failure, and the true battle for the future of Veyrath had only just begun. Back within the safety of the palace walls, Mira spent the following days working closely with Edwin, poring over every fragment of ancient text he could locate concerning the moonborn bloodline, while Roran divided his time between strengthening the palace defenses and sitting beside her during these long study sessions, absorbing every scrap of information alongside her. The silver light she had summoned in the forest had not appeared again despite her attempts to call it forward deliberately, leaving her frustrated and increasingly anxious about whether she would be able to access it when it truly mattered. The old texts suggest the power responds most strongly to instinct rather than deliberate effort, Edwin explained, turning the fragile pages of an ancient book with careful, practiced hands. Moonborn abilities were never meant to be summoned through calculated will alone, but through the deep, instinctive connection between the bloodline and the natural world around it, particularly during moments of genuine need or emotional intensity. That is not particularly helpful, Mira said, frustration creeping into her voice. I cannot simply wait for another life-threatening moment to practice controlling this power. Perhaps not through danger alone, Roran said thoughtfully, but through connection. The bond between us has clearly played some role in awakening your abilities, given that nothing manifested before you arrived at the palace and began forming a bond with me. Perhaps strengthening that bond deliberately could help you access the power more reliably. Edwin nodded slowly, considering this. It is a reasonable theory. The old texts do describe the moonborn line as deeply tied to fated bonds, drawing strength from genuine connection rather than isolation. Your mother fled alone, Mira, cut off from any bond that might have helped her access her own abilities more fully. You are not isolated in the same way. Over the following days, Mira began practicing with Roran directly, focusing on the warmth that stirred whenever they stood close together, trying to understand and eventually control the sensation, rather than waiting for it to overwhelm her involuntarily. Progress came slowly, marked by small successes, a faint shimmer of silver light along her fingertips during moments of calm concentration, gradually growing steadier and more controllable with each passing day. It was during one such practice session, standing together in the palace training yard as evening settled over the grounds, that Mira finally managed to summon the silver light deliberately, holding it steady in her open palm for several long seconds before it faded away naturally rather than dissipating in a sudden burst. That is remarkable progress, Roran said, genuine pride evident in his voice as he watched her palm return to normal. Only days ago, you could barely summon it at all, and now you hold it steady at will. I still do not fully understand what it can do beyond throwing an opponent backward, Mira admitted, flexing her fingers thoughtfully. The old texts mention breaking the curse specifically, but they are vague about exactly how that might be accomplished. Edwin, who had been observing quietly from the edge of the training yard, stepped forward with a thoughtful expression. The curse itself was placed upon your family line, generations ago, Roran, by a moonborn ancestor, wronged by one of your predecessors. The old records suggest it can only be lifted by a willing act of the moonborn bloodline itself, a deliberate choice made freely, rather than power used defensively or by accident. What kind of act? Mira asked. The texts are frustratingly incomplete on this point, Edwin admitted. Some references suggest a binding ritual performed at the source of the original curse, wherever that location might be. Others suggest something simpler, an act of genuine forgiveness or acceptance offered freely between the bloodlines involved. I confess I do not know which interpretation holds true, or whether both might be required together. Their research was interrupted 3 days later by urgent news arriving from the northern border, delivered by a breathless messenger who had ridden through the night without rest. Harold Prescott had gathered his full military strength, combining his own forces with several smaller packs he had convinced or coerced into joining his cause, and was now marching directly toward the capital itself, no longer bothering to disguise his intentions with claims of grievance over Seraphine's imprisonment. "He intends a direct assault on the palace," General Colin reported grimly, during the hastily assembled war council. "His forces significantly outnumber our standing garrison, though our defenses remain strong. We estimate he will reach the capital within 4 days, if his current pace continues." Roran's expression hardened into fierce, unwavering resolve as he studied the map spread across the council table. "We will not simply wait behind our walls for him to arrive. Send word to every allied pack within reasonable distance, requesting reinforcements. And prepare the city for the possibility of siege, just in case our defenses require more time than we currently anticipate." As the council dispersed to carry out his orders, Mira remained behind, studying the map herself, her mind working through the strange, incomplete knowledge Edwin had shared about breaking the curse. If the ritual required confronting the source of the original curse directly, then perhaps Harold's advance, however dangerous, also represented an opportunity she had not yet considered. "Edwin mentioned a binding ritual at the source of the curse," she said slowly, turning to face Roran, once the council chamber had emptied. "Do you know where that source might be located?" Roran's brow furrowed in thought. "The old family records mention a grove somewhere within the northern forest, near the border of what is now Ironwood territory, the place where the original curse was supposedly placed generations ago. I have never visited it myself. Few within my family have, given how dangerous the surrounding territory has become over the years." "Territory currently controlled by Harold Prescott," Mira said grimly. "Precisely," Roran confirmed. "Which means reaching it safely, particularly during an active military conflict, would prove nearly impossible." Mira considered this for a long moment, an idea forming that filled her with equal parts determination and apprehension. What if the coming battle itself provides the distraction necessary to reach it? If Harold's full attention and forces are focused on attacking the capital, the grove itself may be left largely undefended. Roran's expression darkened with immediate concern. "You are suggesting we split our forces during the most critical battle this kingdom has faced in generations, sending you directly into enemy territory with minimal protection. I am suggesting that ending this curse permanently may be the only way to truly end the cycle of instability that has made Veyrath vulnerable to men like Harold Prescott in the first place," Mira said firmly. "If we simply defeat his forces here at the capital, he may retreat and regroup, waiting for another opportunity. But if I can break the curse itself, removing the very instability he has built his ambitions upon, we remove his greatest advantage permanently." Roran was quiet for a long moment, clearly warring between his instinct to keep her safely within the palace walls and his growing recognition that her plan held genuine merit. Finally, he exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders as resolve replaced hesitation. "Then we will need a plan that protects you as much as possible, while still allowing you to reach the grove," he said. "I will not send you alone into enemy territory. Mira, curse or no curse. If you go, I go with you. And we will need Colin's most trusted warriors to accompany us as well, while the bulk of our remaining forces hold the capital against Harold's main assault." "It is a considerable risk," Mira acknowledged. "Every choice available to us now carries considerable risk," Roran replied, taking her hands in his. "But I would rather face this risk alongside you, working to end the curse permanently, than continue defending against Harold's ambitions year after year, waiting for the next attack to come." Mira nodded, drawing strength from the steady certainty in his voice, and together they began planning the dangerous journey that would carry them directly into the heart of enemy territory, toward a grove neither of them had ever seen, carrying nothing but old, incomplete knowledge and the fierce, determined hope that whatever power her moonborn bloodline carried would prove strong enough, at last, to end a curse that had haunted an entire kingdom for generations. They departed under cover of darkness 3 nights later, while Harold's forces were still 2 days from reaching the capital, moving quickly through lesser-known forest paths that Colin's scouts had identified as least likely to be patrolled by Ironwood soldiers. Mira rode close beside Roran, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce determination, as the familiar palace grounds gave way to increasingly unfamiliar, dense woodland. They traveled for the better part of 2 days, resting only briefly, pushing their small party of a dozen trusted warriors, as hard as their mounts could safely bear. Edwin had insisted on accompanying them despite his age, carrying with him the oldest and most fragile texts describing the binding ritual, determined to see the mission through after everything he had already sacrificed searching for answers about Mira's mother years earlier. They reached the northern grove as the sun began setting on the second day, and Mira felt an immediate, overwhelming sense of recognition the moment they crossed into the clearing, the silver bark of the surrounding trees glowing faintly under the emerging moonlight, exactly as she had seen countless times in her recurring dreams. "This is the forest from my dreams," she whispered, moving slowly forward, her hand reaching out to brush against the smooth, cool bark of the nearest tree. "I have stood in this exact place before, in my sleep, more times than I can count." Roran moved close beside her, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees warily, even as wonder filled his expression at the strange, otherworldly beauty of the grove. The old records were correct then. This truly is the source. Edwin approached the ancient tree standing at the very center of the clearing, its trunk far wider than any of the others, its silver bark marked with faint, glowing symbols that pulsed gently in rhythm with some unseen heartbeat. He studied the markings carefully, comparing them against the fragile pages of his oldest text. "According to this," he said slowly, "the ritual requires the willing blood of the moonborn line, offered freely at the base of this tree, along with a genuine act of forgiveness, spoken aloud toward the line that first caused the wrong the curse was meant to punish." "Forgiveness for what wrong exactly?" Roran asked. Edwin hesitated, his expression grave. "The records suggest that generations ago, one of your ancestors betrayed a moonborn woman he had pledged to protect, delivering her location to enemies who sought to eliminate her bloodline entirely, much as your mother's location was betrayed to those hunting her, Mira. The woman survived the betrayal, but her family did not, and in her grief and fury, she placed this curse upon your bloodline, Roran, ensuring that no king from your line would ever again live long enough to fully enjoy the power he had failed to protect." Mira felt the weight of the old story settle over her, recognizing in it painful echoes of her own mother's flight, of the betrayal Edwin had mentioned weeks earlier, without ever discovering who among the palace had been responsible. The parallel felt too significant to be entirely coincidental, and she wondered, with a chill running down her spine, whether the two betrayals might somehow be connected across the generations separating them. "I am ready," she said finally, moving toward the ancient tree despite the uncertainty still swirling through her thoughts. "Whatever this requires, I intend to see it through tonight, before Harold's forces reach the capital." Roran caught her hand before she could kneel at the base of the tree, his expression torn with concern. "Are you certain? We do not fully understand the consequences of this ritual, Mira. The old texts are incomplete." "I am certain," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "This curse has haunted your family for generations, taking fathers from sons, kings from kingdoms that needed their steady guidance. I have the power to end that cycle, and I intend to use it, whatever the cost." She knelt at the base of the ancient tree, and Edwin guided her carefully through the ritual, instructing her to press her palm against the glowing bark, while speaking the words of forgiveness recorded in his ancient text, words meant to be offered not simply as ceremony, but as genuine, heartfelt release of the anger and grief that had fueled the curse for so many generations. As Mira pressed her palm against the tree and began speaking, the silver light within her surged forward with a force far greater than anything she had summoned before, spreading outward from her palm into the ancient bark, illuminating the entire grove in brilliant, pulsing silver light. She felt something ancient and sorrowful stir within the tree itself, a presence that had waited centuries for this exact moment, listening carefully to every word she spoke. "I forgive the wrong done to my bloodline," she said, her voice steady despite the overwhelming power flooding through her. "And I release this curse, not because the pain of it was small, but because I choose a different future than the one built on endless retribution. Let this cycle end here, tonight, so that no more children lose their fathers to a grief that was never truly theirs to carry." The silver light flared one final time, blindingly bright, before collapsing inward and vanishing entirely, leaving the grove suddenly dim and quiet, lit only by the natural silver moonlight filtering through the canopy above. Mira felt the strange, ancient presence within the tree release something heavy and sorrowful, a sensation like a held breath finally exhaled after centuries of waiting, and then, quite simply, it was done. Roran gasped sharply beside her, pressing a hand against his own chest, as though something within him had shifted as well. "I feel it," he said, wonder evident in his voice. "Something has changed, Mira. The weight I have carried my entire life, the quiet, constant awareness of my own mortality, pressing against every decision I made, it has simply lifted." Before they could fully absorb what had happened, shouts erupted from the edge of the grove, and Mira turned to see several of Harold's warriors bursting through the tree line, having apparently tracked their party, despite every precaution taken to avoid detection. Roran moved immediately, positioning himself protectively in front of Mira as their own warriors rallied to meet the sudden threat, steel clashing loudly through the previously peaceful grove. Harold himself emerged moments later, his expression twisted with fury as he took in the scene before him, the glowing symbols on the ancient tree now dark and silent. "What have you done?" he snarled, striding forward despite the chaos of battle unfolding around him. "I have ended the curse your ambitions were built upon," Mira said, standing her ground despite the danger, the silver power still humming faintly beneath her skin, ready to be summoned again if needed. "Whatever advantage you hope to gain from Veyrath's continued instability, it no longer exists." Harold's fury boiled over into reckless aggression as he lunged toward her, but Roran intercepted him before he could close the distance, the two men clashing in fierce, brutal combat, while the surrounding warriors continued their own desperate fight throughout the grove. Mira watched, heart pounding, as Roran fought with a renewed intensity that seemed to draw strength from the very curse that had just been lifted from his shoulders, driving Harold backward with relentless, controlled fury, until finally he disarmed him completely, sending Harold's sword spinning into the underbrush. "Yield," Roran commanded, his blade held steady at Harold's throat. "Your ambitions have failed, Prescott. Yield now, or face the full consequences of everything you have done." Harold's shoulders slumped in defeat as he took in the scene around him, his remaining warriors already overwhelmed and surrendering throughout the grove. "I yield," he said bitterly, though hatred still burned openly in his eyes. The journey back to the capital proved considerably easier than the journey out, buoyed by the victory achieved in the grove, and by news that arrived along the way confirming that Harold's remaining forces, upon learning of their leader's capture, had abandoned their planned assault on the capital entirely, retreating back toward their own territory, rather than continuing a war they no longer had the will to fight. The formal trial that followed weeks later saw both Harold Prescott and Lady Seraphine Voss stripped of their titles and lands, their combined conspiracy laid bare before the entire court, through Edwin's careful evidence, and the testimony extracted during their questioning. Seraphine, given the chance to speak before her sentencing, offered no apology, only bitter resentment at having been passed over for a crown she still believed should have been hers by right, a resentment that seemed to finally convince even her few remaining supporters within the court that Roran's original choice, however unexpected, had been the correct one all along. The coronation took place on a bright, clear morning several weeks later, the same great hall that had hosted the selection ball, now decorated for an entirely different occasion, filled with nobles who had once dismissed Mira as unremarkable, now watching, with genuine respect and admiration, as she knelt before the assembled court to receive her crown. Lena stood proudly near the front of the gathered crowd, tears of happiness streaming freely down her face, while Edwin watched with quiet satisfaction, finally able to honor the memory of the friend he had lost so many years earlier, through the daughter she had died protecting. As Roran placed the crown upon her head, formally declaring her Queen of Veyrath before the assembled court, Mira felt the strange, overwhelming journey of the past months settle into a quiet, steady sense of belonging she had never expected to find. She was no longer the plain, overlooked girl who had stood against the wall at the selection ball, invisible and unremarkable to everyone around her. She was the woman who had broken a generations-old curse, who had exposed a conspiracy threatening the entire kingdom, and who now stood beside a king who looked at her not with the desperate need of a man cursed toward an early death, but with the steady, patient love of a man finally free to build a long and meaningful future. "Nobody expected this," Roran murmured quietly, as the assembled court erupted into cheers around them, his hand finding hers as they turned together to face their kingdom. "Not the nobles, not the court, not even myself, if I am entirely honest." Sometimes, Mira replied, smiling as she looked out over the sea of faces now bowing before her. The ones nobody expects turn out to be exactly the ones the world needed all along. And as the cheers of the kingdom rose around them, echoing through the very hall where her unexpected story had first begun, Mira understood that whatever plain, forgettable future she had once imagined for herself had been left behind entirely, replaced by a life she could never have predicted, built not on the fragile beauty the court had once valued above all else, but on courage, resilience, and a bloodline finally free to embrace the powerful, remarkable legacy it had always carried, quietly waiting until the exact right moment to awaken.